A $6 million hypercar sits silent under harsh workshop lights. Carbon fiber fractured, suspension torn apart, a machine engineered to perfection, reduced to something the manufacturer itself believes should never exist again. Most stories like this end quietly. Insurance writes it off. The chassis number disappears into a database. The remains are parted out, archived, or simply forgotten. But this one didn't end. It became a battle, not just between a broken car and the man trying to rebuild it, but between an entire philosophy of ownership and one of the most exclusive automotive manufacturers in the world. Because when this wrecked Bugatti didn't disappear, it landed in the hands of someone who doesn't walk away from impossible. And that decision changed everything. Matt Armstrong had already built a reputation on bringing cars back from the dead. Not lightly damaged vehicles, not easy repairs, but machines that most people, mechanics included, would look at once and say, "That's finished." And yet, time after time, he proved otherwise. Bent frames straightened, destroyed drivetrains rebuilt, exotic cars resurrected from what looked like scrapyard remains. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to this. Because this wasn't just any hypercar. This was a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport, one of only 60 ever built. A machine so rare, so engineered, so obsessively refined, that even minor repairs require factory-level precision. And now, it was broken in a way that made even Bugatti itself step back and say, no, the crash itself wasn't supposed to be catastrophic. A low-speed impact. The kind of accident that, in most cars, would mean a damaged bumper, maybe a radiator, a few replaced panels, and back on the road. But this wasn't most cars. The front end collapsed like glass under pressure. Carbon fiber panels shattered instead of bending. Structural elements absorbed the impact exactly as designed, by sacrificing themselves completely. Airbags deployed. Mounting points shifted. The front structure, which on a Chiron is part of an incredibly complex carbon fiber architecture, suffered deep internal damage. And that's where everything changed. Because in a Bugatti, damage isn't just visible. It's hidden in layers, in stress lines invisible to the eye, in microscopic fractures, in tolerances so tight that being off by millimeters can compromise the entire car. When Bugatti inspected the vehicle, their conclusion was immediate and absolute. This car should not be repaired outside the factory. And then came the move that ignited everything. They locked the VIN. In practical terms, that meant the car was cut off. No official parts. No dealer support. No access to the ecosystem required to bring it back. It wasn't just a damaged car anymore. It was a blacklisted machine. For Bugatti, the reasoning was clear. Safety, responsibility, control. A car capable of extreme speeds cannot afford uncertainty. A misaligned component, a non-certified repair, a replicated part that behaves differently under stress. Any one of those could turn catastrophic. From their perspective, allowing an independent rebuild wasn't just risky, it was unacceptable. But from another perspective, it raised a different question. If you own the car, shouldn't you be allowed to fix it? That question is what turned a rebuild into a global debate. Because when the car's owner refused to send it back to the factory and instead handed it to Matt Armstrong, the story exploded. Now, it wasn't just about engineering. It was about control. It was about whether ownership ends where manufacturer authority begins. And suddenly, millions of people were watching. The rebuild didn't start with confidence. It started with uncertainty. As panels came off and components were exposed, the reality of the damage became clearer, and worse. This wasn't surface-level destruction. This was deep. The gearbox housing showed signs of stress. Mounting points weren't just bent. They were compromised. Structural areas that should never fail had failed. Each discovery raised the same question again and again. Is this even possible? Because without factory support, every solution had to be found independently. Parts couldn't just be ordered. They had to be hunted, reverse-engineered, sourced through secondary markets, unknown suppliers, or completely unconventional methods. And sometimes they didn't exist at all. There were moments of progress, discoveries that certain components shared part numbers with more common vehicles, small victories that suggested maybe not everything was locked behind Bugatti's walls. But those wins were rare, because most of the car wasn't shared with anything. It was unique, And uniqueness comes at a cost, not just financially, but technically. This wasn't just about replacing parts. It was about recreating precision. Every component in a Chiron is designed to work within an exact system. Remove one variable, change one tolerance, and the entire dynamic shifts. And that's what Bugatti kept warning about. Not publicly at first, but eventually, the conversation became impossible to ignore, because the internet had chosen its sides. On one side, the builder, the idea that no machine is beyond saving, that skill, determination, and ingenuity can overcome even the most impossible challenges. On the other, the manufacturer, the belief that some machines are too complex, too precise, too dangerous to be handled outside controlled environments. And somewhere in between sat a broken hypercar. As the rebuild gained traction, something unexpected happened. Bugatti responded, not with anger, not with threats, but with clarity. Their CEO addressed the situation directly, pushing back against misinformation and explaining the reality behind scenes. The numbers people threw around, hundreds of thousands for simple components, weren't entirely accurate. Still expensive, still extreme, but rooted in something real. Low production numbers, advanced materials, years of engineering spread across a handful of vehicles. This wasn't mass production. This was craftsmanship at its highest level. And then came the core argument, safety, because even if a part looks identical, behaves similarly, even carries the same number, that doesn't mean it performs the same way in a Chiron. Crash dynamics are different. Weight distribution is different. Forces at speed are different. An airbag that works perfectly in one car might deploy differently in another, and at 400 kilometers per hour. Different is not acceptable. That was Bugatti's line. Not arrogance. Not control for the sake of control, but a refusal to compromise on what they built the car to be. Yet despite all of this, the rebuild continued, because stopping would mean accepting that Bugatti was right, and finishing it would mean proving something much bigger. That independence still has a place, even at the highest level. But with every step forward, the pressure increased, because this wasn't just a project anymore. It was a statement, and statements come with consequences. If the rebuild fails, it reinforces everything Bugatti said. That some cars are simply too complex to be rebuilt outside the factory. That safety, precision, and responsibility cannot be replicated in a workshop, no matter how skilled a builder. But if it succeeds, it changes everything. It challenges the idea that manufacturers have the final say. It opens a door for a new kind of ownership, one where even the most exclusive machines aren't beyond the reach of independent hands. And that's why this story matters. Not because of the car, not because of the money, but because of what it represents. A clash between two worlds. Precision versus possibility. Control versus freedom. And as the rebuild continues, the outcome remains uncertain. The car is still in pieces. The challenges aren't over. And the biggest question still hasn't been answered. Can something this complex, this precise, this exclusive, be brought back to life without the people who created it? Or is this where the limits finally appear? Because in the end, this isn't just about rebuilding a Bugatti. It's about redefining what ownership really means, and whether passion alone is enough to overcome perfection. The world is still watching, waiting, because whatever happens next won't just decide the fate of one car. It will decide where the line is drawn, for all of them. And some lines, once crossed, are never drawn again. Because what most people don't realize is that the hardest part of this rebuild was never the damage you could see. It was everything you couldn't. Every hypercar is complex, but the Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport exists on an entirely different level. It isn't just assembled, it's calibrated, tuned down to microscopic tolerances. Every bolt torque, every sensor input, every structural alignment is part of a system that was never meant to be taken apart outside its birthplace. So when Matt Armstrong's team kept digging deeper into the car, they weren't just finding broken parts. They were uncovering systems that had lost their reference points. Mounts that no longer aligned perfectly. Components that technically fit, but didn't sit exactly as they should. Sections of carbon fiber that looked intact on the surface, but carried internal stress that could compromise the entire structure later. And that's the thing about carbon fiber. Unlike steel, It doesn't bend and show you where it failed. It hides it. It cracks internally. It weakens silently. It gives no warning until it reaches its limit again. That's why Bugatti insisted the car needed factory-level inspection. Because inside facilities in Molsheim, they don't just repair. They scan, measure, and validate using tools that most independent workshops simply don't have access to. And yet, the rebuild didn't stop. If anything, it became more determined. Because every obstacle only made the challenge more meaningful. Part sourcing turned into a puzzle no one had ever really attempted at this level. Instead of ordering directly from Bugatti, Armstrong had to trace supply chains backwards, identify manufacturers, cross-reference part numbers, look for overlaps with other vehicles, even if those overlaps were minimal. And occasionally, he found them. A sensor here, a module there, small pieces of progress that proved not everything was locked behind exclusivity. But those moments came with risk. Because just because something fits doesn't mean it belongs. And that's exactly what Mate Rimac had warned about, that using parts outside their intended environment could create invisible dangers, systems that behave differently under stress, components that pass initial tests, but fail when pushed to extremes. And this car was built for extremes. That tension between what's possible and what's safe never left the project, even as progress was made, even as the car slowly started to resemble itself again. Because rebuilding something like this isn't a straight line. It's a constant cycle of progress and setback. One day, a breakthrough. The next, a new problem that resets everything. There were moments when things seemed to move forward quickly. Panels aligned, components fitted, systems began to come together. And then something wouldn't match. A gap too large, a measurement slightly off, a part that refused to integrate correctly. And suddenly, hours, sometimes days, of work had to be undone. That's the reality of rebuilding at this level. There is no margin for error. And yet, the pressure to succeed kept growing. Because millions of people weren't just watching anymore. They were invested. Every video upload became an event. Every update analyzed. Every decision debated across forums, comments, and social platforms. Supporters saw something bigger than just a rebuild. They saw proof that skill and determination could challenge even the most exclusive systems in the world. Critics saw something else. A dangerous experiment. A hypercar being pieced together outside the ecosystem designed to keep it safe. And neither side was completely wrong, because both perspectives were rooted in truth. And that's what made this story impossible to ignore. As the rebuild pushed forward, another layer of complexity began to surface. Electronics. Modern hypercars aren't just mechanical, they're digital ecosystems. Dozens of control units, sensors communicating in real time, systems that rely on proprietary software and encrypted communication. And in the Bugatti Chiron, that complexity is multiplied. Getting the hardware back in place was only half the battle. Making it all talk to each other again was something else entirely. Without factory access, diagnostics become guesswork. Calibration becomes trial and error. And in a system where everything is interconnected, one missing signal can prevent the entire car from functioning. This is where many rebuilds fail. Not because the parts can't be replaced, but because the system refuses to recognize them. And this is where Bugatti's control becomes most apparent. Because even if you rebuild the car physically, without proper integration, it may never truly come back to life. That possibility hung over the entire project, like a question no one could answer yet. Will it start? Will it run? And even if it does, will it ever be what it once was? Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the offer from Bugatti still existed. The option to send the car back, to let the factory handle everything, to restore it to a condition that would carry official validation. But that option came with a cost, not just financially, but philosophically, because accepting it would mean ending the experiment, ending the challenge, and perhaps most importantly, ending the statement. So the rebuild continued, not because it was easy, but because stopping would mean giving up on something bigger than the car itself. And that's where the story takes its most interesting turn, because at some point, this stopped being about proving Bugatti wrong, and started becoming about proving what's possible, even if the odds don't favor you, even if the system isn't designed for you, even if every logical path says, don't continue. There's something powerful about pushing forward anyway. And that's exactly what kept this project alive. But as the car slowly came together, a new question began to emerge. Not about whether it could be rebuilt, but about what it would become if it was. Because a rebuilt hypercar is not the same as an original. No matter how perfect the work is, the story changes a car. Collectors care about provenance, about originality, about factory certification. And without Bugatti's approval, this Chiron Pur Sport would always carry a different identity. Not lesser, but different. A car with a story. A car that represents something beyond its engineering. And that alone changes its place in the world. Some see that as a loss of value. Others see it as something far more unique. A one-of-one narrative attached to a one-of-60 machine. And that's something no factory can replicate. But value isn't just financial. There's another layer. Responsibility. Because if this car returns to the road, it won't just be a symbol. It will be a 1,500 horsepower machine capable of extreme performance. And that raises a question that goes beyond ownership, beyond engineering, beyond even this story itself. Who is responsible when something like this is brought back outside the system that created it? The builder? The owner? The manufacturer? Even if they refuse involvement? There's no simple answer. And maybe that's why the story resonates so deeply. Because it sits in that gray area, where right and wrong aren't clearly defined, where innovation and risk exist side by side, where passion can lead to breakthroughs, or consequences. And as the final stages of the rebuild approach, that tension only grows stronger. Because eventually, there will be a moment, the moment everything has been leading to, the first start, the first ignition, the moment where silence either turns into life, or confirms every doubt. And when that moment comes, it won't just be about whether the car works. It will be about what it represents. A victory for independence, or a validation of why systems like Bugatti's exist in the first place. Until then, the car remains unfinished. The debate remains unresolved. And the world keeps watching. Because stories like this don't come around often. A $6 million machine. A global audience. A direct clash between a creator and a manufacturer at the highest level. And a single question that refuses to go away. Not just can it be fixed, but should it have been attempted at all? Because sometimes, the most important stories aren't about the outcome. They're about the line that gets crossed along the way. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back, only forward, toward whatever comes next. And in the end, it all comes down to a single moment. No cameras moving, no tools turning, no voices explaining what comes next. Just silence inside a workshop that has seen something no one expected to get this far. A machine once declared finished, now standing on the edge of a second life. The Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport was never meant to be here again. Not like this. Not rebuilt outside the walls of Molsheim. Not without the approval of the people who created it. And not after being written off as something that should quietly disappear. But it didn't disappear. It stayed. It fought its way back, piece by piece, decision by decision, risk by risk. And now, everything rests on what happens next. Because this moment isn't just mechanical. It's symbolic. If it starts, if it runs, if it moves under its own power again, then something bigger than a car has been proven. That even at the highest level of engineering, control is not absolute. That skill, persistence, and belief can challenge systems that were never designed to be challenged. That ownership might mean more than permission. But if it doesn't, if something fails, if something was missed, if the system refuses to come back to life the way it once did, then Bugatti's warning echoes louder than ever. That some machines are too complex, too precise, too critical, to be rebuilt outside the hands that built them. And maybe that was never the real question. Maybe it was never just about whether this car could be rebuilt. Maybe it was about whether it should have been. Because this story was never just about a hypercar. It was about a line between freedom and responsibility, between passion and precision, between what we can do and what we should do. And that line has now been crossed. No matter what happens next, the industry has already felt it. Manufacturers are watching. Builders are watching. Owners are watching. Because this changes something. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But eventually, stories like this shift the rules. Quietly, slowly, but permanently. And somewhere in that silence, just before everything is decided, you realize something. This car will never just be a Bugatti again. It will always be the car that refused to end, the car that challenged the system, the car that forced a conversation no one could ignore. And whether it roars back to life, or remains a reminder of limits that shouldn't be crossed, its story is already complete, because it proved one thing the moment the rebuild began. Perfection can be broken, but what comes after? That's where the real story begins. And now, all that's left is to turn the key.